Now we're going to move on to Leila, who's going to be talking about living with the flying foxes. And as Rod said, you know, flying foxes can polarise people, and as a threatened species, many people care for them and value their role in keeping the forests healthy. But on the other hand, you know, they can roost in cities and towns and cause issues. So Leila's going to talk about flying fox management and emergency response, and discussing some of the key human-wildlife conflict issues and sharing advice on how Victorians can live alongside these amazing animals. So over to you, Leila.
Thanks, Lindy. I'd like to just start by also paying my respect to the First Nations people on all the lands that we're all joining on today. So I'm calling in from Dja Dja Wurrung country in central Victoria. And I'd like to just acknowledge the Djara people and their elders past and present, and their strong and ongoing connection to wildlife. So I work in DEECA's Statewide Wildlife Advisory Services team, and what we do is we provide non-regulatory advice to people in the community and stakeholders on wildlife issues. And we're normally talking about non-threatened wildlife, so the animals that you see in your towns, in cities, in rural areas, and that you live with on a daily basis. We also work with land managers where they have flying fox camps and can provide advice on what they, on the best kind of management actions that they can do to manage risks and support the species as well. And today I'm going to be talking about living with flying foxes in Victoria. Going to touch on some of the different views that people have around flying foxes, some of the challenges, some of the work that DEECA does with flying foxes, and also provide some of those tips and advice, as Lindy mentioned. And I'm also going to be focusing on the grey-headed flying foxes, which are the main species in Victoria. So to start with, I'd like to consider some of the different ways that people view flying foxes. As Rod mentioned, they can inspire a lot of different feelings in people. And firstly, they are culturally important to some First Nations communities across their range. They're also a threatened species, so listed as vulnerable both in Victoria and in the Commonwealth, and that's largely due to loss of habitat, but also current drivers like extreme heat and ongoing loss of habitat. They're a key part of our urban wildlife, so it's not every day that you get to see a threatened species, particularly in big numbers in towns and cities. And these guys, you wouldn't easily miss them, so they're pretty conspicuous. And they can also be just viewed as really interesting animals. So they're one of the largest flying fox species in Australia. They're capable of moving those really huge distances, and they've got some really interesting behaviours. So they're quite fascinating to watch if you see them in colonies interacting with each other and socialising. And also something that a lot of Victorians will be familiar with is the fly out from the camps at night. And just as a bit of an example, this is a little video that one of my colleagues took at the Orbost camp. There we go. And you can see that it's really impressive when you do see these animals flying out en masse in the evening. So it can be something really incredible that can inspire people. Ooh, hang on. Sorry. There we go. And as Rod mentioned, they're also valued for their ecological role in our particularly forest system. So as a pollinator and a seed disperser of native species. But they also congregate in really big numbers. So hang on a sec. There we go. When they do gather in those big numbers, often in the middle of towns and cities, they can cause big impacts on people's amenities. So they're social animals, they can be noisy, and particularly at times when people are trying to sleep or go about their daily business. They do create some smells and some mess, and you can see here some of the kind of headlines that pop up when flying foxes do cause some of that human-wildlife conflict, particularly in towns and cities. They also can be perceived as displacing people from public areas. So when they roost in particularly urban parks and gardens, they can restrict, displace people, I guess, from accessing some of those areas or be perceived to be restricting access. And when they do roost in trees en masse, as Rod mentioned, they can have impacts on those species. So they might be impacting on trees that are valuable or even heritage listed in some of those gardens. And while they do have diverse diets, they can also eat orchard fruits. So they can also be perceived as damaging crops, and that can include commercial crops and also backyard trees. They can also be viewed negatively in terms of a carrier of diseases that can potentially impact on human health. So you can see with all these different views, both positive and negative, there can be a huge range of opinions of flying foxes should be managed and maintained in the environment. And it's quite a lot to balance for land managers in terms of how they look after flying foxes and also balance those risks. As Rod mentioned, that kind of conflict can also really escalate when camps appear suddenly. So if it's in an area where they haven't been before and they suddenly turn up, or if they increase rapidly, which is something they can do. So towns do provide that kind of suitable habitat, both in terms of roosting and foraging resources, a suitable climate, but particularly when you have some of those ephemeral resources, so things like flowering eucalypts that increase when the foraging values increase in abundance, so say with a mass eucalypt flowering event, you can end up with a huge influx of flying foxes. So because they're nomadic, they're moving around the landscape in a really fluid manner, and they can increase in numbers really quickly. And this is a little headline from a case a couple of years ago where there was a mass eucalypt flowering in southeast New South Wales, and there were really big increases in the number of flying foxes in some of those coastal towns. But it is really important to remember that those resources are ephemeral, so they provide those temporary foraging resources for flying foxes. So the numbers might increase in number, but then usually when those food resources are depleted, the animals will move on to other areas. Now, just in terms of the status of flying foxes in Victoria, so land managers or landowners are responsible for managing risks caused by wildlife on their land. And there's a number of protections in place to consider flying foxes and potential impacts. So under Victoria's Wildlife Act, all wildlife, including flying foxes, is protected, and prior permission is required to do any willful disturbance, harassment or harm of wildlife. They're also listed as a threatened species, and particularly the Commonwealth does provide additional guidance for managing flying foxes. The National Recovery Plan was released a couple of years ago, and there's also a referral guideline which contains advice for land managers in terms of what kind of actions they can do that do or don't require, would or wouldn't be perceived as a significant impact on the species. And they also list and describe nationally important camps. So these are camps where you get particularly large numbers over a longer period of time. So it's either camps where you've got more than 10,000 in a couple of years, over 10 years, or more than 2,500 every year for the last 10 years. And it's important to consider disturbance of flying foxes because they can be particularly vulnerable to disturbance, particularly at some times of year. So for example, when females are heavily pregnant or have young pups, or when they're experiencing periods of extreme heat or food stress, and you can end up with high levels of illness and mortality during these times if they are disturbed. As Rod mentioned, they do occur really widely across Victoria at the moment. So this map shows the camps that we know they have been in the last 10 years or so. And the red dots are all the ones that we think they're occupying at the moment. So they use these areas really dynamically. So some of the camps might be permanent, others will be used seasonally, and others just occasionally, depending on food resources. But we are seeing at the moment particularly high numbers of flying foxes in Victoria, and are seeing them occupying quite a large number of camps, so almost 30 camps across Victoria. And we're also seeing them turn up in a few unusual places that they haven't been seen recently, as Rod mentioned, so around Ballarat, in Castlemaine even, and really kind of across that whole range. If you did look at that though, you might think that they do have a bit of a couple of corridors along the coast and coming down through Albury and Bendigo and along the southwest coast as well. But if you consider some of the distribution mapping for the species, so and the records that we have actually recorded, then you can see that there's potential habitat for the species over a much larger area of the state. So just jump forward a bit. So this map here shows the purple squares are the VBA records, so the records that have been entered into the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas for grey-headed flying foxes, and also the pink shading is a rough approximation of what the Commonwealth has identified as areas that where grey-headed flying foxes may or are likely to occur. So you can see that they could actually be over quite a larger area of Victoria, and that is what we see as well. So they eat a diverse range of species and they could occur over much of the state. And when we consider little red flying foxes as well, then they're also found even further north. So as Rod mentioned, in Swan Hill and other areas around central and northeast Victoria. I will just mention as well, so on this map, the 4 orange dots are the currently listed nationally important camps for flying foxes. There's 3 others that could potentially be considered nationally important in the future, in Tatura, Sale and around Mallacoota. And there's also a permanent camp up in Albury, but that's technically across the border. Now, DEECA works with a network of stakeholders to collect data and contribute to the National Flying Fox Monitoring Program. So this involves quarterly counts using a range of different methods. So depending on the nature of the camp and the location, you might use either static counts. The picture on the left shows some people counting at the Bendigo camp, or you might use a fly-out count, so counting the flying foxes in the evening as they're flying out. And that data is used to inform camp status and national estimates as well. If you do want to contribute data and observations of flying foxes, so when they do turn up in unusual places, you can let our team know, but you can also log them on the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas. And as we discussed earlier, flying foxes eat flowers and fruit, and backyard trees can provide these in abundance at the right time of year. So when trees are fruiting or flowering in your backyard, they can attract flying foxes in pretty big numbers to feed overnight, and this can have a fairly big impact on people. But it's important to remember that it's usually only for a short time. So once that flowering or fruiting is wrapped up, the flying foxes will move on. But if you are wanting to manage some of those impacts, there's a few things that you can do. So you can start by parking your car in an area away from trees, so either under shelter or on the road. You can bring your washing in overnight. You can clean your paths more regularly to remove some of that, the droppings. And you can also consider netting your trees with wildlife-friendly netting. Hang on. Now, if you do want to use backyard fruit netting, it's important to make sure that the netting is compliant with the new regulations for household fruit netting. So wildlife netting needs to be of a mesh size of less than or equal to 5 by 5 millimetres at full stretch. So this means that the netting, you wouldn't be able to put your finger through the netting. And there's a few extra tips for how to ensure that your netting is wildlife friendly. To start with, you can use white netting, which is more visible for wildlife. You've got to make sure that you want to fix that netting to the trunk or branches of trees to avoid animals getting caught. You could also consider using bags to net the branches or clusters of fruit and leave some fruit for wildlife to feed on. And it's also important to remove nets once the fruit is picked and also check them daily for any wildlife that might be caught. And there's more information on DEECA's website, and that also links into Agriculture Victoria's Harvest Without Harm program. Now, disease is a concern for many people from flying foxes, and many wildlife species do carry diseases. So there are risks that some of these diseases can be transmissible to humans, and this includes flying foxes. So they've got really powerful immune systems to combat illnesses. But these can mean that they can carry some diseases that are of concern to people. And the primary disease that might be of concern is Australian bat lyssavirus, or ABLV. And this is a rare but fatal disease. It is really rare in the bat population. So it's thought to be to infect less than 1% of the population and be more likely in sick or injured bats. Cases of human infection are also exceptionally rare, with only 3 confirmed cases reported to date, but all of these have resulted in death. Now, ABLV is transmitted via saliva, so through a bite, scratch or wound, or with contact with mucous membranes, which is eyes, nose and mouth. And these are associated with being in close contact with bats. So for example, handling a bat and exposure to ABLV isn't associated with working or living near a bat colony, and contact with feces or urine isn't known to transmit infection either. But if you do find yourself scratched or bitten by a flying fox, or you come into significant contact, you should seek medical attention urgently and apply first aid. So although ABLV is rare, it is important to treat all bats as though they could be carrying the disease. Therefore, you shouldn't touch or handle flying foxes yourself, and that's the real key message around bat safety. So if you do find yourself in a situation where a flying fox needs to be handled, you should always call a wildlife rescuer or a vet. So only people who are trained, vaccinated and wearing PPE should be handling flying foxes. And it's also the case for dead flying foxes. So if you do find a dead flying fox, we don't recommend touching it. You can confirm it's deceased gently with a tool like a shovel. And if it is, dispose using tools and PPE according to local laws. And finally, if you think your pets have had any kind of significant contact with flying foxes, you can call the emergency animal disease hotline if your pet, and they can provide some advice. The other disease that people might have concerns about is the Hendra virus. So this is another disease that can have serious impacts on people, but humans are infected via horses, so there's no evidence of direct transmission from bats. And there's no known cases of human or horse infection in Victoria. You can prevent infection in horses though through vaccination and also keeping horses away from trees used by bats. And there's some great resources online to find out more about bat safety. So the Wildlife Health Australia page for bat health is a fantastic resource. Also the Department of Health, Better Health Channel and Agriculture Victoria have information on their websites. So flying foxes can be injured in our towns and cities in particular. So they can get caught in fruit netting, in fencing, so barbed wire in particular. They can also get electrocuted on power lines. But as we just mentioned, if you do find a sick or injured bat, it's best not to try and look after it yourself. You can call a local wildlife rescuer. And to find a locally available, trained and vaccinated rescuer, there's a few different options. So you can call the 136 number to talk to a DEECA customer contact person. You can use the Help for Injured Wildlife tool, or you can call a rescue service like Wildlife Victoria. If you do find a sick and injured flying fox, it's best to give them some space, so keep people and pets away. And as I just mentioned, still take care with lifeless flying foxes. So you can call a wildlife rescuer for advice, particularly at some times of year they might have a pup, might be carrying a pup, so it's good to be able to check for them as well. And if you do find electrocuted flying foxes, so they can get caught on power lines, if you find one on the ground, it's worth calling a wildlife rescuer to see if they can assist, and call your local power company if you find one stuck on power lines, and you can also call council if they've fallen to the ground. DEECA's also recently prepared and released the Victorian Rehabilitation Guidelines. So these were prepared with a broad range of stakeholders and experts and released last year. And there's a specific chapter on flying foxes, and that provides comprehensive info for rescuers and rehabilitators on how to capture and handle flying foxes safely and how to care for them and release them as well. And it also contains advice on reporting requirements, given that grey-headed flying foxes are a threatened species. And they are quite comprehensive, but you can access an online version on the DEECA website. As you may know, flying foxes can also be affected by extreme heat. So while they've evolved to manage increased temperatures with a few different behaviours that help them regulate their temperature or thermoregulate, they're not necessarily able to cope with prolonged periods of extreme heat or particularly high temperatures, say above 40 degrees. Some of the behaviours that they have include wing flapping, seeking shade, panting and licking fur, and then as that heat progresses, they start to clump up on branches and trunks and move down out of the canopy. And as that heat-related illness increases and conditions worsen, you can see potentially high rates of illness and mortality in flying foxes. And Matthew Moe and colleagues found that in the 2019 to 20 summer, at least 5,000 flying foxes died in Victoria from extreme heat, and over 72,000 flying foxes of different species died across the country that year. So it can be a significant source of mortality for the species. And this is a little video of a female and a pup exhibiting some thermoregulatory behaviour this summer, so flapping wings and staying in the shade. Now it is important as well to avoid any kind of additional disturbance to camps when they are experiencing hot days. So they can be more sensitive as they move closer down trunks and closer to people, and they can be agitated by more disturbance, which can exacerbate that heat stress. It's therefore important to give them that space so that they can try and manage that heat. And access to camps can be restricted during those events. DEECA is the lead control agency for responding to wildlife welfare issues, including heat-related illness or heat stress in flying foxes, and the Victorian response plan for heat stress was released, this summer in 2024. So heat stress response aims to minimise welfare impacts to colonies during those extreme heat events in a safe way. And the response plan outlines a framework and accountabilities for a collaborative response with deployment of Victorian government staff and Zoos Victoria staff, with support from the Wildlife Emergency Support Network, including trained and experienced vets and volunteers working together to monitor and manage some of those heat-related impacts on flying foxes. And you can find out more about that on our website as well. But that's it for my information, but I would like to point people to our website for some more information if you're interested in finding out more about some of the work that DEECA does on flying foxes. There's information on the wildlife and fruit trees campaigns, and also some really great resources online on bat safety. As I mentioned, not handling bats is the kind of key message there. If you just admire them from a distance. It's the best way to go. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leila. That was a lot of wonderful information and a really good overview of how we can better live with our flying foxes, because they're such amazing animals. We want to live with them as well. A few questions. Is there a way of reporting unsafe wildlife netting? If somebody notices that somebody else has got the wrong sort of fruit netting around their fruit trees, is there a mechanism for reporting that?
I'm not sure at the moment, so that is something we can look into and maybe report back in the chat.
Yep. Okay, great. And is there any reported conflict or competition between grey-headed flying foxes and swift parrots, given that both are using mass flowering events? And the person asking it was saying, you know, specifically on the south coast of New South Wales.
I'm not sure about that. Yeah, that would be a really interesting question, because they are both using those ephemeral resources and moving around the landscape to where those flowering events are occurring. I'm not aware of research looking at that, but it would be interesting to consider.
Yep. And Emma's just put in the chat that in terms of if anybody sees some fruit netting that's the wrong sort, they can report it to the conservation regulator. So
yeah,
thanks for that, Emma. And Rod's already answered this, but do little reds and grey-headed flying foxes share camps? You know, how much do they do that?
Yeah, definitely. We've got a few camps in Victoria where little reds and grey-headed flying foxes co-occur, at least during some parts of the year. So I think little reds are generally considered even more nomadic than grey-headed flying foxes. So I know in Bendigo we sometimes do record little red flying foxes, but they tend to dip in and out quite quickly. And they're also recorded through the northeast camps pretty regularly, and then also in northern Victoria, and even down into around Melbourne as well sometimes.
Yeah, I heard that there was some in Melbourne at the moment. I'm not sure if somebody...
Yeah, I've heard that too.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, I'm just looking at the questions. Yeah, the other thing is, how much do you think, because there's a lot of people out there that do a lot of wonderful communication efforts in terms of giving talks to their local community to try and change people's attitudes to flying foxes. Have you got any observations on the effectiveness of that?
I'm not sure about, not in particular, but I think the more people understand about flying foxes, the better. I think some of the reactions to seasonal influxes, people might think that those animals are all going to stick around forever now, and that can really challenge people. But if the community can understand that the broader landscape is supporting these species for a short time, and it's really important given they're a threatened species and their ecological role, that they might not, they might be able to understand that it's just a short time and they're going to be moving on again. So an increased understanding is always valuable, and trying to appreciate some of the more fascinating things about the species.
Yeah, and certainly, you know, the one-on-one discussions plus the, you know, talks at the camp on dusk, or, you know, talks to the local communities can be really beneficial, but also some of the social media following. Somebody at the start was saying, you know, if people follow people that are hand rearing flying foxes and all the cute photos that come through, that always changes people's attitudes as well. So wonderful.
Yeah, they're definitely very cute, especially the little pups.
Yeah.
And seeing the mums with the pups as well can be really interesting watching them. So they all tend to give birth. They give birth in spring, and you can see the females with the pups on their chests, feeding and going, you know, resting or flapping their wings, and it's really interesting to watch.
Yep, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Leila. That was a wonderful presentation and lots of really good information.